We turn today to Walt Whitman. Whitman is one of those revolutionary figures in American literary history who's worthy of a class really unto himself, and I won't be able to do Whitman the level of justice that he deserves in today's discussion. We will have an opportunity to talk more about Whitman in coming videos, but he's a revolutionary figure who in many respects changed American poetry. Inside Whitman's poetry, you might say, is sort of the sum total of everything that came before Whitman. And then Whitman's poetry serves as this crux wherein nothing that came after Whitman was really going to be ever the same. It's either going to be part of Whitman or a repudiation of the sort of poetic aesthetic that Whitman has. So he's a central and very important figure in our course. And I think, of course, you can tell really how central he is in our course by the fact that the video itself is devoted just to the topic of Walt Whitman. We're going to be talking in this video about his poem, Song of Myself. And even then, we'll only be able to touch on the portions of the poem, because the poem itself, as you well know, is incredibly long, and it really kind of captures or is attempting to capture the entirety of the American experience and the experience of being human and being in a human body and how you relate to the world around you. Song of Myself first appeared untitled in Whitman's first collection of poetry, which was titled simply Leaves of Grass. And Leaves of Grass was published in 1855. 12 poems total in Leaves of Grass, and none of them had titles. Song of Myself is the first poem in that collection. As you can tell when you look at Song of Myself, it looks like nothing else that we have explored in this course so far. Partly that's because Whitman takes the poetic form and just turns the volume up to 11, you might say. William Cullen Bryant provided an important break in American poetry by embracing the form of blank verse. You'll remember that term, which is unrhymed lines of iambic pentameter. We'd previously talked about the heroic couplet, which is a dominant literary form for poets during the Enlightenment. Bryant adopts blank verse, which is unrhymed poetry, a style that he gets from William Wordsworth, who's writing a key important romantic figure in Britain, and he's writing in blank verse. And Whitman then goes one step further than blank verse, and he writes in free verse. So free verse is not just unrhymed poetry, right? There's no rhyme to the poetry, but it's also no meter to the poetry. That doesn't mean that there's not rhythm and there aren't certain cadences that are established and that sound isn't important. Those are all still important poetic concepts to Whitman. But he's not writing in a strict meter, where every line of poetry has the same rhythm or metrical rhythm to it. Some of Whitman's lines are short, some of Whitman's lines are very long. There's a kind of unpredictability to Whitman's lines. And so he breaks free from the strictures of poetry at the time. It was well received by some, not well received by many. I mentioned in our context on Whitman that part of the mythology of Whitman is that the American poet John Greenleaf Whittier, when he received his copy of Leaves of Grass, famously threw it into a fire. And Whittier was a poet who really adhered to the strictures of the metrical form. So you can see that what Whitman's doing is a bit of a rebel to the American poetic tradition. But Whitman was well received by Ralph Waldo Emerson. And in many respects, Whitman is seen as taking up the call from Emerson to develop a distinctive style of American poetry. In your anthology, the Norton Anthology of American Literature, Volume B, in the 10th edition, Emerson's essay, The Poet, is printed. I didn't have you read The Poet for our course, but I do want to take a look at an excerpt from that essay right now. On page 247, Emerson discusses what he would like to see from American artists. And he says the following: "I look in vain for the poet whom I describe. We do not with sufficient plainness nor sufficient profoundness address ourselves to life, nor dare we chaunt our own times and social circumstance. If we filled the day with bravery, we should not shrink from celebrating it. Time and nature yield us many gifts, but not yet the timely man, the new religion, the reconciler, whom all things await. Dante's praise is that he dared to write his autobiography in colossal cipher, or into universality. We have yet had no genius in America with a tyrannous eye, which knew the value of our incomparable materials and saw in the barbarism and materialism of the times another carnival of the same gods whose picture he so much admires in Homer, then in the Middle Age, then in Calvinism. Banks and tariffs, the newspaper and the caucus, Methodism and Unitarianism are flat and dull to dull people, but rest on the same foundations of wonder as the town of Troy and the temple of Delphos, and are as swiftly passing away. Our log rolling, our stumps and their politics, our fisheries, our Negroes and Indians, our boasts and our repudiations, the wrath of rogues and the pusillanimity of honest men, and the northern trade and southern planting and western clearing, Oregon and Texas are yet unsung. Yet America is a poem in our eyes. Its ample geography dazzles the imagination, and it will not wait long for meters." Emerson is putting out the call for a poet to rise to the occasion, to capture the essence of America in poetry. And it's Whitman who seems to rise first to that challenge that Emerson lays down. I asked you to look at Whitman's preface to Leaves of Grass, and I think in that preface you are going to hear Whitman saying things that very much mirror the passage that I just shared to you from Emerson. And I think the preparation for studying Song of Myself, by reading the preface to Leaves of Grass, you get the sense of what Whitman is trying to do. It's almost as if the preface says, here's what I'm trying to do, and Song of Myself is, here's what I'm doing. I'm going to show you now what it is that I'm doing. Whitman writes on page 1152 of your anthology, from the preface to Leaves of Grass: "The Americans of all nations at any time upon the earth have probably the fullest poetical nature. The United States themselves are essentially the greatest poem." Here is not merely a nation, but a teeming nation of nations. Here is action, untied from strings necessarily blind to particulars, and details magnificently moving in vast masses. Here is the hospitality which forever indicates heroes. Here are the roughs and beards and space and ruggedness and nonchalance that the soul loves. Here the performance disdaining the trivial, unapproached in the tremendous audacity of its crowds and groupings, and the push of its perspective spreads with crampless and flowing breadth, and showers with prolific and splendid extravagance. He says the genius of the United States is not best or most in its executives or legislatures, nor in its ambassadors or authors or colleges or churches or parlors, nor even in its newspapers or inventors, but has always most in common people. Whitman wants to be a poet of the common person, who he sees as the foundation of America. It's one of the reasons Whitman has been described as the bard of democracy. He's the poet of the common man, and he sets out intentionally to make himself thus. And I think you can hear in just the passage that I read that sort of Whitman-esque listing style. He likes to list things. There's another passage on page 1153 that captures it. It's about halfway down the page. He writes, when the long Atlantic coast stretches longer and the Pacific coast stretches longer, he easily stretches with them north or south. He spans between them also from east to west and reflects what is between them. On him rise solid growths that offset the growths of pine and cedar and hemlock and live oak and locust and chestnut and cypress and hickory and lime tree and cottonwood and tulip tree and cactus and wild vine and tamarind and persimmon, and tangles as tangled as any canebrake or swamp, and forests coated with transparent ice and icicles hanging from the boughs and crackling in the wind, and the sides and peaks of mountains, and the pasturage sweet and free as savanna or upland or prairie, with flights and songs and screams that answer those of the wild pigeon and high-hold and orchard oriole and coot and surf duck and red-shouldered hawk and fish hawk, and white ibis, and Indian hen, and cat owl, and white pheasant, and quaw bird, and pied sheldrake, and blackbird, and mockingbird, and buzzard, and condor, and night heron, and eagle, right? I mean, this is, you gotta catch your breath, especially if you have a cold like I do at the moment. That pervasive sense of cataloging, where it almost seems impossible for Whitman to list everything that he wants to encompass in that moment. That's an important stylistic device for Whitman, and it has that sense of democratic essence to him. So I want to turn to Song of Myself now, and the version that you have printed in the anthology, the complete version of Song of Myself that's in the anthology, is from one of Whitman's later revisions of Leaves of Grass. What Whitman does for his entire career is he takes this very slim volume that he starts with, Leaves of Grass, from 1855, and for the next 30 plus years, he just keeps revising it. He goes in and he tweaks the poems, he goes in and he adds poems, and it grows and it grows and it grows and it grows. And so depending on what edition you're reading, the poems are going to look different, or the words might be a little different. Whitman's going to edit some things out, he's going to add some things in. So the edition of Song of Myself that we have included in our textbook is from one of the late editions of Leaves of Grass. The date on it is the 1881 edition. So you can see We've got almost 30 years worth of revising going on inside the poem. This lecture isn't going to talk about comparing the 1855 Song of Myself to the 1881 Song of Myself. That's a thoughtful and interesting concept that could be done, but that's not what we're going to focus on. Instead, what I want to focus on with Song of Myself is really trying to get that sense of what Whitman is really up to in the poem. What are the key ideas that he is trying to explore, and what are some of the more famous passages in the poem? Why are they famous? Why are they important? Why is this considered revolutionary? So start with me, if you would, on page 1168. If your anthology, this is the opening of Song of Myself. And Whitman writes, I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume, you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. I loaf and invite my soul, I lean and loaf at my ease, observing a spear of summer grass. My tongue, every atom of my blood, formed from this soil, this air, born here of parents, born here from parents the same, and their parents the same. I, now 37 years old, in perfect health begin, hoping to cease not till death. Creeds and schools in abeyance, retiring back a while, sufficed at what they are, but never forgotten. I harbor for good or bad. I permit to speak at every hazard. Nature without check, with original energy. Now, over the years, some people have seen the opening of this poem as somewhat egotistical or egocentric, right? I mean, the title of the poem is Song of Myself, and as we'll see later in the poem, Whitman makes clear that he's writing about himself. He identifies himself in the poem. I, Walt Whitman, he says. So we know he's writing about himself. So it's Song of Myself, and the first line is, I celebrate myself, and I sing myself, and what I assume, you shall assume, right? And there is an I-centric quality to the poem, and that can be a turn-off for people initially. But I want to make the case to you that the important portion of this introduction comes in the line, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. That line is a central concept or a central idea or theme to me inside the poem. It says to me that what Whitman is trying to do in this particular moment is to embrace the idea that what he writes about with himself is something of a universal characteristic. We might not see the world exactly the way that Whitman wants to, but he is inviting us to see the world through his eyes. And so to see the world through his eyes, he thinks it's important that he also celebrates himself. And by celebrating himself and inviting us to see the world through his eyes and having every atom belonging to him as good belongs to you, he's allowing us to come together, fusing us together as one sort of human race together. And the ending of the poem has that idea as well, a recognition that we're not all together quite yet, but we can all get to that point together, which we'll get to when we come to the end of the poem. For Whitman, one of the most important ideas inside this poem is established in the second section of the poem. This is where he introduces a central idea to his poem. It's an idea that we saw echoed in Emerson and echoed in Thoreau, but it's the idea that you cannot learn everything that you need to know from academic study. That academic study may be important, but that academic study alone is not going to get you there. That you yourself have to go out into the world. You yourself have to discover. He says, have you reckoned 1,000 acres much? Have you reckoned the earth much? Have you practiced so long to learn to read? Have you felt so proud to get at the meaning of poems? Stop this day and night with me, and you shall possess the origin of all poems. It's a lovely sentiment, right? Have you gone to school and learned how to read poems? Well, good for you, right? But stop here with me. Be here with me now. Be with me together. And I will show you the origin of all poems. Right? Our appreciation of the world is the origin of all poems. And so it's almost like poetry is this mediator between you and the world. And it's important, right? I mean, we're reading a poem, so we have to understand that the poem itself is communicating that idea to us. But for Whitman, there's almost this sense that we want to get through the mediation, go beyond the mediation, and get life from the source, or get the information about the human experience from the source, right? You shall possess the good of the earth and sun. There are millions of suns left. You shall no longer take things at second or third hand, nor look through the eyes of the dead, nor feed on the specters in books. You shall not look through my eyes either, nor take things from me. You shall listen to all sides and filter them from yourself. If only you can open your eyes in the way that he wants you to, he thinks, you'll no longer get your information from dead figures or people in books, but you'll experience the life as it vibrates in front of you. In section 5, he opens, I believe in you, my soul. The other I am must not abase itself to you, and you must not be abased to the other. Loaf with me in the grass. Loose the stop from your throat. Not words, not music or rhyme I want, not custom or lecture, not even the best. Only the lull I like, the hum of your velvet voice. I mind how once we lay such a transparent summer morning, how you settled your head athwart my hips and gently turned over upon me and parted the shirt from my bosom bone and plunged your tongue to my bare stripped heart and reached till you felt my beard and reached till you held my feet. He's talking here about the communion of the body with the soul, right? He opens I believe in you, my soul. And the you here is addressed to the soul. The feeling of the body and the soul coming into alignment with each other. And the image of the two becoming into an alignment with each other is given this erotically charged language. It's one of the aspects of the poem that was most controversial in its own day, right? Even a transcendentalist, even an innovator, and a call for originality from Emerson. Emerson himself felt Whitman had gone too far with the body stuff in this poem, with the erotically charged imagery in this poem. And when Emerson says to Whitman, I really think maybe you should try to dial it back a little bit, that just makes Whitman want to do it all the more. There's another erotically charged passage in the poem. It's one of the poem's most famous passages. It's part 11 of Song of Myself on page 1175. Whitman takes on the persona here of this like roving eye, this moving figure among these young men who are bathing in a river, and this woman who watches them, and he sees them the way that the woman sees them, or perhaps has the woman see them the way he wants to see them, because Whitman's homoeroticism is a well-known staple within his poetry. He writes, 28 young men bathed by the shore, 28 young men and all so friendly, 28 years of womanly life and all so lonesome. She owns the fine house by the rise of the bank. She hides handsome and richly dressed at the blinds of the window. Which of the young men does she like the best? Ah, the homeliest of them is beautiful to her. Where are you off to, lady? For I see you. You splash in the water there, yet stay stock still in your room, right? He's imagining that she's behind the glass, watching these men along the shore of this of this body of water, but she's imagining herself as if she's in the water with the men, right? That's what he means by, you splash in the water, yet you stay stock still in your room, right? That sense of imagination, that fantasy that comes from watching something. Dancing and laughing along the beach came the 29th bather. The rest did not see her, but she saw them and loved them. The beards of the young men glistened with wet. It ran from their long hair. Little streams passed over their bodies. An unseen hand also passed over their bodies. It descended tremblingly from their temples and ribs. The young men float on their backs. Their white bellies bulge to the sun. They do not ask who seizes fast to them. They do not know who puffs and declines with pendant and bending arch. They do not think whom they souse with the spray. So the act of the watching forms this connection, and this invisible hand reaches out to touch the thing that is desired. Section 11 is one of the most famous images in the poem, but another one is section 6. And this is a section that allows Whitman to meditate on grass, right? Remember, the title of the poem, or the title of the collection that this poem appears in, is Leaves of Grass. And leaves is it's kind of a pun, right? Because we also refer to the pages of a book as leafing through, right? The leaves of a book. And so the grass itself is not only the spears and leaves of grass, but also the book itself is a kind of act of nature, and is connected back to nature in that way. And so every time grass comes up in the poem, or plants come up in the poem, you should slow down and you should really consider and what Whitman is trying to say in the passage. Section 6 introduces up to this symbol of like this web of life, the cycle of life, the living and the dying. Grass is a very ordinary plant, right? It grows in yards. We almost take it for granted because it's just kind of something that's there. I'm looking out the window of Ogle Hall here at the Sellersburg campus and seeing a giant area next to the parking lot of grass. We take it for granted, yet we stylize it. We forget sometimes that it's alive. It's got this common element to it, but also consider how gargantuan it is, right? Think about how much of the land is covered in grass. Think about how much we invest in grass. And grass itself has this kind of simplicity to it, but also this profoundness to it. And what's what Whitman is calling up in the poem. He says on 1172, section 6, a child said, "What is the grass?" fetching it to me with full hands. How could I answer the child? I do not know what it is any more than he. I guess it must be the flag of my disposition, out of hopeful green stuff woven. Or I guess it is the handkerchief of the Lord, a scented gift and remembrancer designedly dropped, bearing the owner's name some way in the corners, that we may see and remark and say, whose? Or I guess the grass is itself a child, the produced babe of the vegetation. Or I guess it is a uniform hieroglyphic, and it means sprouting alike in broad zones and narrow zones, growing among black folks as among white, Canuck, Tuckahoe, Congressman, Cuff. I give them the same. I receive them the same. And now it seems to me the beautiful uncut hair of graves. What do you think has become of the young and old men? He says later in the section. And what do you think has become of the women and children? They are alive and well somewhere. The smallest sprout shows there is really no death. And if ever there was, it led forward life and does not wait at the end to arrest it, and ceased the moment life appeared. All goes onward and outward, nothing collapses, and to die is different from what anyone supposed, and luckier. So this emphasis on the cycle of life, right? The grass itself is a reminder that nobody's ever really gone. The cycle of life continues. It goes onward, it goes outward, nothing collapses. Things may change, he says. To die is different from what anyone supposed, and luckier, he argues. I want to draw your attention just to section 15. I don't have time to read section 15 aloud to you, but it has this kind of Whitman-esque catalog. I mean, there's a reason Whitman's name now is associated with this adjective of listing things, because it's a characteristic, stylistic element that he uses in his poetry. There's a moment in the poem here early where it's almost like his eye is wandering around the earth, or his soul is wandering around the earth and keeping track of all the things that it is seeing. He recognizes that so much of the thoughts that he has about these things, they're not original, right? In section 17 on page 1180, he says, these are really the thoughts of all men in all ages and land. They are not original with me. If they are not yours as much as mine, they are nothing, or next to nothing. If they are not the riddle and the untying of the riddle, they are nothing. If they are not just as close as they are distant, they are nothing. This is the grass that grows wherever the land is and the water is. This, the common air that bathes the globe. So there's a sense here, there's not, he's trying to take, there's not something necessarily original about the claims that he's making, and yet there's a way in which we still have to be reminded of it. There are many things like that in life that aren't original, and yet we benefit from the process of being reminded of them. And maybe that's what literature at its core really does well, right? Is it brings back to us that which is not original, but which we must constantly need to be reminded of in new and original ways. Sections 21 to 25 allow some reflections on poetry itself and his effusive voice in that process. I wish I had time to pause and talk about them in as much detail as I could. I want to make sure, though, we're having time to explore some of Whitman's stylistic devices. And so for this, turn with me to section 33 of Whitman's poem. 33 is not the only place that we see this in the poem, but it does show us one of Whitman's preferred stylistic devices. The literary device here is called anaphora, A-N-A-P-H-O-R-A, anaphora. It's the free verse poetry of Walt Whitman does not rhyme. Right? I made that point earlier. There's no meter and there's no rhyming, and the lines themselves can vary in terms of their length. That doesn't mean there's not rhythm, though. Meter has that da-da, 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 da-da rhythm to it. But rhythm in general is just a series of sounds that move in a particular way and to have patterns built into them. So Whitman doesn't have meter, but he still has rhythmic qualities inside the poem. And one of the ways that he's able to establish some rhythmic qualities inside his poetry is through the use of anaphora. An anaphora is when the first part of a line is repeated multiple times. So this particular section, section 33, has some of that going on, right? Look at page 1192. Where the, right? Where the panther walks to and fro on a limb overhead, where the buck turns furiously at the hunter, where the rattlesnake suns his flabby length on a rock, where the otter is feeding on fish, where the alligator in his tough pimples sleeps by the bayou, where the black bear is searching for roots or honey, where the beaver pats the mud with his paddle-shaped tail. And then we get over the, and then where the, it continues again. And the cataloging, it creates this sense of accumulation of images. And then on page 1193, we get pleased with. Starting the lines in with the same words creates a sort of hypnotic pattern to it. We get wrapped up in it. And Whitman doesn't stick with it exclusively for an entire section. He shakes it up, but he creates this rhythmic, hypnotizing pattern that we get absorbed into. As we approach the end of the poem, Whitman tells us or reflects on how big the poem is outside of human experience. This is, again, I think, some people look at this and they see a lot of moxie, a lot of presumptuousness, a lot of egotism, the fact that somebody thinks they can write a poem that transcends human experience. Still others look at it and see a lot of imagination and creativity and courage to try to write a poem that transcends human experience and at the same time pulls us all in. I'm part of the latter camp, right? I find this poem highly impressive, highly mesmerizing in the way that it functions. And in section 41, he even wants to go above and beyond traditional religion, right? He says, I heard what was said of the universe, heard it of several thousand years. It is middling well as far as it goes. But is that all? And he says that he seems to transcend the idea, right? He's the voice of sort of a new religion. A religion that offers up the idea that all humans are divine in their own way. All have powers that are sort of equal to the gods. And that God himself, or the idea of God, is found in all people. And that's what makes people remarkable and beautiful to Whitman, because it's all there. He says in section 48 to 49, he takes this idea and he continues it to show us. I have said that the soul is not more than the body, and I have said that the body is not more than the soul, and nothing not God is greater to one than oneself is. And whoever walks a furlong without sympathy walks to his own funeral dressed in a shroud. And I or you, pocketless of a dime, may purchase the pick of the earth, and to glance with an eye or show a beam in its pod confounds the learning of all things. And there is no trade or employment, but the young man following it may become a hero. And there is no object so soft, but it makes a hub for the wheeled universe. And I say to any man or woman, let your soul stand cool and composed before a million universes. And I say to mankind, be not curious about God, for I who am curious about each am not curious about God. No array of terms can say how much I am at peace about God and about death. I hear and behold God in every object, yet understand God not in the least. Nor do I understand who there can be more wonderful than myself. Why should I wish to see God better than this day? I see something of God every hour of the 24, and each moment then. In the faces of men and women I see God, and in my own face in the glass I find letters from God dropped in the street, and everyone is signed by God's name, and I leave them where they are, for I know that wheresoever I go, others will punctually come forever and ever. There's a kind of paradox in what Whitman is saying here, but I encourage you to sort of sit and grapple with it for just a moment, right? He says, don't be curious about God. Right? Be at peace about God. Why? He says, because God's in everything. I see everywhere I look, he says. I see God, and yet I don't understand anything that I see. If it's everywhere I look and I don't understand any of it, then it's almost a waste of time to sit and try to ponder it. Or not almost a waste of time. For Whitman, it is a waste of time to try to sit and ponder it. Don't sit and ponder. See it, acknowledge it, immerse yourself in it, and then go with it. Right? It's a transcendentalist concept. Just be in it and go with it. You'll feel it. You'll experience it. And there's no sense in trying to labor over it, right? Leave it for someone else to see. Someone else is going to see it. Because it's everywhere. And he has that great line, no array of terms can say how much I am at peace about God and about death. And in section 49 now gives us a commentary on death. And as to you, death, and you bitter hug of mortality, it is idle to try to alarm me. To his work without flinching, well, let's pause on that first. As to you, death, and you bitter hug of mortality, it is idle to try to alarm me, right? And what he means here is that there's no sense of fear that can come with death. If you see life and death as working in this cycle together. I hear you whispering there, O stars of heaven, O suns, O grass of graves. And there's that image from earlier in the poem that's now come back to us. O perpetual transfers and promotions. If you do not say anything, how can I say anything? Of the turbid pool that lies in the autumn forest, of the moon that descends the steeps of the soughing twilight, toss sparkles of day and dusk, toss on the black stems that decay in the muck, toss to the moaning gibberish of the dry limbs. At the end of the poem, he shares what's probably one of the most quoted lines from all of Whitman. It's one of his most famous lines. And I want us to think about it because I think there is something very transcendentalist about it. Especially if you think about Emerson and self-reliance. The essence of Emerson's self-reliance is that consistency becomes something that we get so wrapped up in that we lose what we're trying to do. The past and present wilt, I have filled them, emptied them, and proceed to fill my next fold of the future. Listener up there, what have you to confide in me? Look at my face while I snuff the sidle of evening. Talk honestly, no one else hears you, and I stay only a minute longer. Do I contradict myself? Very well, then I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes. Part of encompassing everything is encompassing contradiction. You can't encompass everything and not encompass contradiction. And for Whitman, very well. Do I contradict myself? Very well, I contradict myself. And I'm large, I contain multitudes. Now the closing of the poem is a fascinating extension of the invitation that he has put through the entirety of the poem. Right? There's a sense here in which it's almost hard to understand how he's going to pull all of this together. But there's also a sense in which, of course, it was going to end this way. It could only ever end this way. The spotted hawk swoops by and accuses me. He complains of my jab and my loitering. Right? This hawk swoops by and complains that Whitman's been talking too much and standing still for too long. I too am not a bit tamed. I too am untranslatable. I sound my barbaric yawp over the roofs of the world. The last scud of day holds back for me. It flings my likeness after the rest, and true as any on the shadowed winds, it coaxes me to the vapor and the dusk. I depart as air. I shake my white locks at the runway sun. I effuse my flesh in eddies and drift it in lacy jags. I bequeath myself to the dirt to grow from the grass I love. If you want me again, look for me under your boot soles. You will hardly know who I am or what I mean, but I shall be good health to you nevertheless, and filter and fiber your blood. Failing to fetch me at first, keep encouraged. Missing me one place, search another. I stop somewhere, waiting for you. That feeling that perhaps he's just a little out in front of us, but he is going to wait for us. If we've become awokened by the end of the poem to the ideas that Whitman is trying to introduce to us, he's telling us he's just a little farther ahead. Come, he's waiting for us. Come be with him. And that image of reunion and togetherness that has pervaded the entire poem from the opening lines, that sense of the overlapping qualities of human nature and life, the sense of everything all at once brought all together. The image at the end of the poem is that invitation to merge again, and reminds us of the beauty of human experience and the fact that that experience itself is where we draw the most of our understanding. And the process of reading the poem should open our eyes to that, but that reading the poem alone is not going to take us all the way there. Now it's the invitation to walk forth at the end of the poem. It's a beautiful idea. And though I'm not sure Whitman would have necessarily used the term transcendentalist to describe himself, and he certainly wasn't part of the transcendental circle that met regularly with Emerson, he nevertheless embodies that spirit and wants us to break out of the confines of the life that we have and to see the bigger picture. And to understand, too, that what we have experienced inside this poem, this gargantuan, contradictory, listing, baffling, erotic, natural poem, is that invitation to go into our lives, to be there and to be among one another, and the knowledge that Walt Whitman's just a little bit ahead of us, waiting for us. He's invited us now to come join. And the choice of whether we join is of course, entirely up to us. Now, we will circle back around to some of Whitman's Civil War poems when we get to the end of our course, and look at poetry from the Civil War itself. Those poems are different than this one, but they nevertheless have a romantic quality to them that we'll want to slow down and we'll want to consider. A lot of Whitman's poems are not the same after the war. It's a traumatic experience for him, as we'll talk about when we get to his Drum Taps poems. But nevertheless, the influence that has endured from him since his poems were written and revised in the mid-19th century has been absolutely tremendous. And it will be hard to read American literature or American poetry in many respects going forward without thinking about the way that the sort of larger-than-life quality of Whitman hangs over American literature and seems to suffuse all of it with his invitation to breathe, to live, and to